Hey guys, tonight we're sliding back into one of the most mythologized, exoticized, and totally misunderstood spaces in all of world history, the Ottoman Imperial Harem. That's right, silken drapes, gold-drenched chambers, and seductive glances over porcelain cups of rosewater. But before your mind drifts off to a land of belly dancers and fan fiction, here's your "you probably won't survive this" reality check. Unless you're the Sultan, or his mom, you'd last maybe 4 days in the harem. Tops! One wrong look, one jealous rival, or just one boring conversation, and you'd be invited to the Bosphorus with a stone bag tied to your feet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the gates of Topkapi Palace, the central heartbeat of Ottoman power. It's the 16th century, the empire is at its absolute peak, and inside this massive complex of courtyards, kitchens, gardens, mosques, libraries, and tiled pavilions is a quiet, guarded section known simply as the harem, a place of whispers and secrets, echoing footsteps, and distant music. You're led through the carriage gate, past armed janissaries and turbaned guards who don't even glance in your direction, as if you don't exist. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and oud. You cross under an arch carved with intricate floral patterns and step onto cool marble tiles, soft from centuries of bare feet. The space grows quieter, almost sacred. You've entered a hidden world that very few people ever saw, and even fewer understood. Now forget every oil painting you've ever seen of lounging women feeding each other grapes. The Ottoman harem wasn't a free-for-all sex lounge. It was more like a hyper-controlled, female-dominated government school, but with life-or-death stakes and satin cushions, somewhere between a prison and a finishing school for imperial consorts. Yes, sex happened here, but not the way you think. The word harem comes from the Arabic root HRM, meaning forbidden or sacred. It wasn't just a room, it was a concept of seclusion, separating women of status from public life. The women who lived here weren't all sex slaves. Some were wives, others were political hostages, some would never so much as see the Sultan in person, let alone share his bed. You walk deeper in. The walls are covered in Iznik tiles swirling with deep blues and soft greens, glazed so finely they almost reflect your face. Latticed windows filter the sunlight into dappled mosaics on the floor. Occasionally a silk curtain rustles as someone passes behind it. No talking, just the sound of distant fountains and a zither being tuned somewhere far down a corridor. This place is calm, but it's the kind of calm that hides 1,000 secrets. There's no map of the harem. It's a maze by design, not metaphorically, literally. Twisting corridors, dead-end rooms, sudden corners and staircases that lead to nowhere. It's meant to disorient, and it works. You begin to feel like the walls are watching you, that someone's always nearby, just out of sight, because they are. You step through the courtyard of the Black Eunuchs, where towering, expressionless men in dark robes stand posted with military posture. These are the Kızlar Asa, enslaved Africans, castrated and trained for loyalty. They're the only men allowed inside this section of the palace, aside from the Sultan himself. There's something almost spectral about them. They know everything, they see everything, and they say nothing. One of them glances at you, just once, a flicker, like they know your deepest thoughts. A scholarly debate still lingers around how these eunuchs gained such extraordinary influence. Were they simply loyal servants, or shadow rulers, pulling strings behind the velvet curtain? Some even held more power than viziers. They kept the secrets of the Sultan's private life, and sometimes they were the secrets. Now you pass into the courtyard of the concubines. This is where it starts to feel more alive. The scent changes, more floral, sharper, like crushed petals and amber. You see a few women here, all walking with the same graceful discipline, like trained dancers on their mark. Not a foot out of place. Silk rustles, anklets chime softly. You don't stare, though you want to. These women are lethal, in their own way. Each one has a role. There are servants, trainees, favourites, and above all the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who rules this entire world with absolute authority. You haven't seen her yet, but you will. Everyone does, eventually, and most of them regret it. Each concubine is known by a name given to her here, not her real name. That gets erased at the door. They're often chosen young, taken from Circassian villages, Georgian towns, or Balkan provinces. Light skin, fine features, and musical talent were prized. They were converted to Islam, taught Ottoman Turkish, and trained in everything from classical poetry to embroidery to, let's say, highly specific interpersonal skills. A fringe fact here: some girls were trained with mirrors, yes, full-length mirrors, to learn how to move, dance, undress, and even make eye contact in ways that flattered their features from every angle. It was like a finishing school mixed with a stage rehearsal, designed to mould a perfectly seductive shadow. As you walk through the hall of the favourites, there's a sound, barely a whisper, coming from behind a screen. A soft, rhythmic song sung in a dialect you don't understand. You pause. A girl, probably no older than 17, sits behind the screen, painting her fingertips with henna. She doesn't acknowledge you. But her presence fills the room. Then, out of nowhere, a bell rings. Low, soft, but insistent. The women around you pause, eyes flick upward. A eunuch glides in, silent as breath. He doesn't speak, just bows, turns, and disappears down another hall. That's the sign. The Sultan has chosen someone tonight. Maybe it's random. Maybe it's political. Maybe someone whispered in his ear. You don't know. And honestly, neither does she. Yet, all you know is, somewhere deep in this velvet-draped maze, a single young woman is about to be prepared for a night that could change her life, or ruin it completely. You trail deeper into the belly of the harem where the passage narrows and the air thickens. It's not just a corridor anymore, it's a cocoon of whispers and footsteps, as if the walls themselves are listening. The smell shifts again, this time to musk and something else. Ambergris, maybe. It's faint but unmistakable, the kind of scent that clings to everything: fabrics, hair, breath. You're headed toward one of the most curious aspects of the harem's world, the architecture itself. Because if you want to understand how the Ottoman harem functioned, you first have to understand the labyrinth it lived in. The harem wasn't just a wing of the palace, it was a self-contained universe. It had its own courtyards, kitchens, baths, mosques, libraries, and infirmaries. Entire lives began and ended within these walls, sometimes without a single glimpse of the outside world. In Topkapi Palace, the harem was tucked into the third courtyard, the most private part of the complex. You could walk through the outer courts as a diplomat, a soldier, even a servant. But unless you were a eunuch or one of the women inside, this place was invisible to you. The architecture made sure of that. Every doorway is just slightly too small or too narrow. Every window is covered by a carved screen or tinted glass. Light pools in unexpected ways, reflecting off gold, bouncing from tile to water basin, but never giving you a full, clear view. It's not just for beauty, it's tactical, designed to control vision, movement, and sound. Everything has a purpose. And yes, you're probably wondering, were the women actually imprisoned? The answer depends on who you ask. Some scholars argue the harem was a prison dressed in velvet, a gilded cage of sex and servitude. Others say it was the most secure women's space in the empire, where daughters of nobility and rivals were protected, educated, and prepared for possible power. The truth is probably floating somewhere in between. Like everything else here, it's a contradiction in silk. As you walk, you come upon a marble fountain, small, precise, trickling in that soft way that makes you feel like time has slowed down. These fountains weren't just decorative, they served a purpose too: white noise. The constant flow of water kept conversations private. So when a girl gossiped about another, or a eunuch passed along the Sultan's preferences, the sound wouldn't carry. Imagine whisper networks layered beneath the sound of burbling fountains, like an ancient version of encrypted DMs. You round a corner and see the privy chamber of the Sultan, but you don't dare go in. That space is sacred. It's the beating heart of the harem, and it has its own gravity. The tiles there shimmer differently: richer cobalt, deeper crimson. The ceilings are laced with gold leaf so thin it almost seems to breathe. This is where he receives his chosen concubines. But not always for sex. Sometimes for music. Sometimes just to talk. Sometimes to test them. It's all part of the architecture, not just of stone, but of power. The rooms surrounding this chamber belong to the Cardins, the favourites. Women who had already shared the Sultan's bed and impressed him enough to earn something far more valuable than attention: space. To have your own private room in the harem meant that you weren't just pretty, you were remembered. And in this world, being remembered was the only thing that kept you safe. You pass through one of the bathing areas, the hammam, and the air is steamy, thick with eucalyptus and orange blossom. Domed ceilings overhead, sunlight filtering through small glass discs set like jewels into the ceiling. This is where the concubines bathe before an audience. Yes, an audience. Not of men, but of women, older matrons, eunuchs, and sometimes the valid sultan herself. They inspect posture, grooming, conversation skills. Even cleanliness is political here. One quirky detail you wouldn't expect: the bathwater was sometimes perfumed with musk, sandalwood, and even powdered pearls. Yep, crushed pearls. Not because they did anything useful, because luxury was performance. You weren't just being cleaned, you were being polished for presentation, like a living artifact. The corridors twist again, and now you're in the hall of the Valid Sultan, the largest and most lavish part of the harem. This woman, Sultan's mother, remember, is the real ruler behind the curtain. She has her own audience chamber, her own servants, and access to imperial funds. Nothing in the harem happens without her approval, from concubine promotions to pillow arrangements. If the harem is a theatre, the Valida is both director and producer. It's said that she could make or break a girl's future with a single glance. You could be the Sultan's favourite for one night, but if his mother didn't like your manners, or the way your eyes moved when you bowed, you'd be reassigned to laundry duty within hours. Or worse, transferred to the old palace, a dusty exile for women past their usefulness, a kind of antique purgatory. You'd live out your days remembering the one night the Sultan almost liked you. There's scholarly debate over just how powerful the Valid Sultan really was. Some historians paint her as a silent schemer, others argue she was the empire's most stabilizing force, keeping the Sultan sane, managing the harem's rivalries, and even shaping foreign policy behind the scenes. One Valid Sultan, Kösem, essentially ruled the empire through her sons and grandsons. Another, Nurbanu, secretly corresponded with the Venetian Republic. And you thought your mum was intimidating. As you linger near a velvet-draped archway, you hear another set of footsteps. Two girls walk past you in matching slippers, whispering in a language you don't understand. One of them laughs, but it's nervous, forced. She glances around quickly and then they vanish into another hallway. Here's the thing, nothing is casual here. Even laughter is calculated, even friendship is suspect. And yet, somewhere beneath all the politics, the rituals, the inspections and silks, there's still a very human truth. Everyone here is trying to survive. Some want love, some want power, some just want a room of their own, and all of them are trapped in a place designed to be both a sanctuary and a spectacle. You turn a final corner, and there it is, the courtyard of the favourites. Quiet, serene, deceptively calm. In the centre is a tree, old, knotted, with branches reaching toward the sky like fingers. Around it are arched walkways and tiled benches. This is where the Sultan's favourites sit during the day, gossiping, practising music or reading poetry. Tonight, one of them will be chosen. She'll be bathed, perfumed, dressed in silk stitched with gold thread. She'll walk barefoot through the palace, escorted by eunuchs, and silence. And she'll step into a world very few have seen, and even fewer leave unchanged. The architecture of the harem didn't just contain desire, it shaped it. The sun slips below the Bosphorus, casting a rose-gold haze over the tiled rooftops of Topkapi, and the harem begins its evening metamorphosis. Day is for duty, for hierarchy and ritual. Night, though, night is something else. You feel it in the way the light softens in the courtyards, how the air thickens with incense, how the women walk a little slower, more deliberate. The day's sharp edges blur into a softer hum. But don't mistake it for peace. This is when the real games begin. You find yourself watching from a high corridor as a group of girls in matching kaftans gathers in a semicircle around a low platform. They're seated on cushions, brushing each other's hair, giggling in a way that feels sweet on the surface. But you've been here long enough to know better. These girls aren't friends, not really. They're competitors, and every flick of the eye, every compliment, every shared fig is part of the choreography, because tonight someone will be chosen, maybe one of them, maybe not, but they all want it, or they've at least convinced themselves they should want it. To be selected by the Sultan means a step up. It means better clothes, better food, a better room. It means status. And in this closed world, status is everything. There's a strict hierarchy among the harem women, like some obsessive silk-wrapped social pyramid. At the top is the Valid Sultan, of course. No one speaks over her. Below her are the Cadens, the official consorts. A sultan could have 4, in keeping with Islamic law, though some fudged the numbers when politics required it. Below them are the Iqbals, or favourites, and then the Gediklis, newer girls with some training. At the very bottom, the Asimis, fresh recruits, barely literate, still learning to walk in slippers without tripping. You for now are observing a cluster of Iqbals and Gediklis. They've already shared the Sultan's company at least once, or they're being groomed for it. Each one has her own strengths. One is a lute player with a voice like velvet and a laugh that draws attention like a bell. Another is a calligrapher, said to write verses so beautiful even the Sultan's scribes copied them. A third, she's quiet, soft-spoken, but you can tell by the way others watch her when she's not looking. She's dangerous. Here's something they don't tell you in the fairy tales. The harem ran on ambition. Raw, strategic, sometimes ruthless ambition. The Sultan might choose you once, sure. But what you did with that night, that's what mattered. And there were rules. So many rules. You couldn't just flirt or wink your way into favour. You had to understand the whole theatre of desire. How to dress, when to bow, how to read poetry aloud with just the right edge of longing. It wasn't just about beauty. It was about skill. Seduction here was an art. And the stakes were so high, you didn't dare make a wrong move. There's a tale, half legend, half history, about one concubine who learned that the Sultan adored a certain pomegranate sorbet his mother used to make. She spent weeks bribing kitchen workers, testing recipes, adjusting spice levels until she could recreate it exactly. The next time she was summoned to his chamber, she didn't wear new jewels or reveal a shoulder. She simply brought the sorbet. She never left the top tier of the harem again. The women around you are masters of this kind of thinking. Every gesture is a calculation. Every gift is a gamble. There are no second chances here. And let's not pretend these women didn't turn on each other. Oh, they did. Quietly, and with a degree of elegance that made it even more chilling. A stolen necklace. A rumour whispered just loud enough to reach the valide's ears. A tiny pinch of ground glass in someone's tea. Enough to cause illness, not death. You're in a place where betrayal could wear silk shoes and smile sweetly. One fringe fact. Some concubines were trained to spy on each other as part of their advancement. Loyalty tests. A girl might be told to befriend a rival and report back what she said when the lamps were low and the doors were closed. If she succeeded, she moved up. If she got caught, well, she might be reassigned to cleaning chamber pots, if she was lucky. This social dance didn't just affect who got chosen for a night. It shaped the entire future of the empire. Why? Because if a concubine bore a son, she became a sultana, and her son became a prince, with a shot at the throne. Think about that. A single night, a single embrace, could change the entire imperial line. But only if the Sultan chose you again, and again, and then again. One time wasn't enough. You had to be more than beautiful. You had to be unforgettable. There's a soft knock on the wood behind you, and you turn to see a young eunuch, barely a teenager, bowing his head. He says nothing, just gestures for you to follow. You move down another corridor, one that curves and narrows until you're in a quieter, more refined part of the harem. The air here smells like rosewater and sandalwood, and you hear the soft rustling of silk. You've entered the selection chamber. This is where the Valid Sultan receives the eunuch's suggestions, where concubines are formally offered for the Sultan's consideration. Not all are chosen from this room. Sometimes the Sultan surprises everyone, but this chamber is where the game becomes official. Inside, 3 women are kneeling on cushions, heads bowed. They don't look at each other. Their hands are folded in their laps, still. A eunuch whispers something into the ear of an older woman seated behind a screen. You catch a glimpse of her jeweled slipper, just one, and even that feels like a royal command. This is the gate. Pass through, and your entire life could change. And just when you think the silence can't stretch any further, a chime sounds. The chosen concubine is lifted to her feet. She doesn't smile. She doesn't react. Just bows, lowers her gaze, and follows the eunuch out of the room. The others remain kneeling, unmoving, not a whisper, not a tear. This is the hierarchy of desire, silent, sharp, and utterly unforgiving. The chosen concubine disappears behind a velvet curtain, guided by two silent eunuchs, and just like that, the selection chamber returns to stillness. You're left standing in the afterglow of a moment that could change history, or be forgotten by morning. No applause, no celebration. Because here, the most important nights of a woman's life begin in silence. Now comes the ritual. It's not just about walking into the Sultan's bedchamber. It's a performance, centuries in the making, and it begins the moment she steps into the preparation room. You follow at a respectful distance, eyes adjusting to the dim golden light. The room is hushed, perfumed, and warm. Heated floors, steaming basins, and candles flickering in every corner. Two older matrons are already waiting. Their hands are quick and practiced. First, a bath. Not just for hygiene, but symbolic, washing away the day, the competition, the noise of the harem. She's transformed from a courtly woman to a vessel of imperial desire. She sinks into the marble basin, water infused with rose petals, saffron threads, and crushed bay leaves. The scent is dizzying, almost narcotic. She says nothing, and no one speaks to her unless necessary. Talking is distraction. This is a night of absolute focus. Her hair is rinsed with scented oils, her skin rubbed with an exfoliating paste made from ground apricot pits. Then a milk rinse. Yes, milk. And finally a splash of cool water, enough to make her shiver and bring the blood to her skin. The result? A glow. That dewy, legendary glow people later describe in poetry and song. Now comes the drying. Not with towels, but with fanned silk and soft muslin cloths, passed over her skin like whispers. It takes forever, but that's the point. Every motion is deliberate, choreographed, calming. The goal isn't just physical perfection, it's transformation. When she rises from the bath, she's no longer an Iqbal. She is for one night the Sultan's entire world. She's dressed in layers of silk so fine they seem to float. Undergarments first, embroidered with tiny gold threads and fastened with delicate pearl buttons. Over that, a sheer robe, followed by an outer kaftan dyed in imperial purple and stitched with designs of the tugra, the Sultan's signature seal. The message is clear. Tonight, her body belongs to the empire. Now the perfume. Not too much. He must lean in to notice. A touch of amber on the wrists, jasmine behind the ears, and a tiny dab of attar of roses behind the knees. Yes, behind the knees. The Ottomans were nothing if not thorough. There's even a soft powder brushed onto her skin, made from crushed iris root and cinnamon bark. If he kisses her shoulder, he'll taste it. They think of everything. Her hair is combed out and twisted into a braid wrapped with gold thread, then pinned with mother-of-pearl combs. Makeup is minimal but strategic. Kohl lines her eyes, lengthening them to a soft almond shape. Her lips are tinted with a balm made from crushed mulberries and beeswax, just enough to redden them without leaving a stain on the Sultan's clothing. Again, deliberate. You don't leave a mark unless you mean to. The final step. A necklace placed around her neck by one of the eunuchs. Always the same necklace. A single emerald pendant said to have belonged to the Sultan's grandmother. It's a symbol of trust, but also surveillance. That necklace means you're being watched. A curious fringe detail. Some women reportedly practiced lying still for hours as part of their training. Not for submission, but for restraint. In this culture, passion wasn't expressed in flailing limbs or cries of delight. It was in the quiet. How still she could stay, how deep she could let her eyes go, how gently she could pull someone in without saying a word. You hear footsteps outside the room. The eunuch has returned. He nods once, and the women around her retreat. She stands slowly, her silk robes whispering against her skin, and walks toward the doorway with the grace of someone who knows every eye is on her, even when no one is looking. The walk from the preparation room to the Sultan's chamber is not long, but it's heavy. Heavy with meaning. The halls are quiet, lit with hanging lanterns that throw gentle shadows along the tiled walls. She's flanked by two eunuchs, one carrying a basin of scented water, the other a bundle of spare linens. Not for her, for the Sultan. Everything must be fresh. She enters the imperial bedchamber. This room is unlike anything else in the palace. The ceiling is high and domed, painted with stars and verses from Persian poetry. The walls are tiled in deep cobalt and black, trimmed in silver. The floor is covered in silk carpets so plush you can barely hear footsteps. And in the centre is the bed. It sits high off the ground, draped in gauze curtains, pillows stacked in excess. There's a low table beside it, where sherbet, figs and chilled rosewater wait in porcelain cups. She bows once deeply. The Sultan is not here yet. She is seated on the edge of the bed. Posture perfect. Eyes lowered but aware of everything. The etiquette of this moment is ancient. She's not allowed to look directly at him when he enters, not unless he speaks to her first. Her body must be angled slightly toward the door, but her hands folded. It's a game of statues. One wrong move, and the night ends before it begins. There's a tension here, one you didn't expect. Not just nerves, but danger. Because the Sultan is not just a lover. He's a ruler, a man who decides wars, hands out executions and trusts almost no one. This moment, this intimate moment, is one of the few places where he is both man and monarch, and the women who walk into this room must navigate that duality. Finally the door opens. The Sultan enters. He's dressed not in regalia but in a simple silk robe, hair freshly oiled, beard trimmed. His face is unreadable, expression soft but neutral. He doesn't speak at first, just walks around her in a slow circle, taking in her posture, her perfume, her stillness. You realise this is part of the ritual too. He's not just observing her, he's reading her. And now the open scholarly debate. What exactly happened next? Some sources claim these encounters were ceremonial, bordering on awkward. Others say they were deeply sensual, filled with poetry and whispered conversation. A few suggest the Sultan said almost nothing at all, that the women were expected to lead, to read his moods and adapt. Truth is, we'll never know for sure. The records are vague, and the people who knew. They took those nights to the grave. Tonight, as she stands to meet him, you feel the weight of it all. Centuries of ritual, layers of meaning, and two people in a room that history has turned into legend. And yet, it's still just that. Two people. One powerful, one vulnerable, both playing parts in a very old story. Behind the walls, the rest of the harem sleeps, or pretends to, waiting to see who will return glowing, and who will not return at all. Dawn creeps over Istanbul with a blush of pale orange, brushing the tips of minarets and the gilded domes of Topkapı Palace. Inside the harem, most of the women are still wrapped in sleep or pretending to be. The night is over, but its consequences are just beginning. Somewhere behind those ivory doors the concubine has finished her performance. Whether it ended in tender whispers, a cold dismissal, or something far stranger, no one knows yet. But they're waiting, and this is where it gets even more complex. See, the women of the harem aren't just performing for the Sultan, they're performing for each other, for the Valide Sultan, and for the centuries of women who came before them. They all know that one night can launch a life or destroy it completely, and it all begins with how a girl gets here in the first place. You take a different path now, slipping back in time, before the perfume, before the silk, before the name change, to the very first step of the journey: selection. Contrary to the romantic fantasy of slave markets filled with swooning beauties and mysterious veils, the process was far more, let's say, bureaucratic. Young girls were chosen from across the Ottoman Empire and beyond, not through auctions, but through networks of informants and recruiters trained to identify beauty, potential and pliability. These scouts roamed the Balkans, the Caucasus, parts of North Africa, and even Central Europe. They weren't looking for random peasants. They had types. Circassian girls were highly prized for their pale skin and delicate features. Georgian girls were admired for their long limbs and grace. Many of these girls came from families in debt or defeat, some handed over as political gifts, and others, brace yourself, sold by their own relatives, convinced this would give their daughters a better life. And sometimes it did. The empire called it devshirme when it applied to boys, young Christians taken to become elite soldiers or scholars. But for girls there was no official term, just silence, a kind of feminine devshirme, quiet, constant and rarely acknowledged. They were gathered discreetly, transported across the empire in guarded caravans, and brought to the palace like rare gems, some terrified, some curious, all of them unprepared for what came next. You find yourself watching such an arrival. A girl no older than 13 steps down from a cart, blinking at the polished marble of the palace gate. She's not dressed like a concubine, not yet. Her clothes are rough, her hands calloused. She holds her chin high, but her lip trembles when no one's watching. She doesn't know it yet, but her name will be erased, replaced with something floral or celestial, Gulbahar Einer Mahidevran, something easier for the harem to absorb. This is her first test, obedience. She's led to the Asimi Odalera, the novice rooms, where she joins a dozen other girls like her. They're watched constantly, not just for misbehaviour, but for spark. Can she learn the language? Can she sing? Does she walk gracefully? How does she respond to music, to discipline, to silence? The ones who show promise are promoted. The rest are trained for servitude, or eventually sent to provincial households. Training begins immediately. It's intense. Every day she wakes before dawn for prayers and cleaning. Then comes instruction. Reading, writing, embroidery, music, dance, court etiquette, and Islamic theology. She's taught to hold a teacup the proper way, to walk with a book balanced on her head, to sit in a position that flatters her figure without appearing provocative. And yes, there are lessons in intimacy, but they aren't what you think. Forget the Kama Sutra-style manuals of the West. In the Ottoman harem, instruction in the arts of love came through coded storytelling, old poems and personal mentoring. Elder concubines, known as kalfas, would pass down secrets in hushed voices, usually during bath time or embroidery sessions. A smile timed with a breath. The power of stillness. Where to place your hands when you bow. What to say. More importantly, what not to say when the Sultan touches your hair. A fringe fact from palace records. Some girls practice conversation with parrots to perfect their tone, pitch, and clarity. Yes, parrots. Trained to squawk if your voice was too shrill or your accent off, because in a room full of potential queens, a harsh syllable could cost you everything. Back in the Asimi wing, the girl listens carefully, learns quickly. She watches how the senior women carry themselves, how they never enter a room first, how they lower their eyes but never their chin, how they glide instead of walk. She mimics them until her own movements start to look regal. Her hands soften, her posture changes, her accent fades. Slowly the palace begins to claim her. After a year, maybe two, she's given new clothes. Nothing flashy, just a soft silk robe in mint or cream. Her bedding improves. She's allowed to sit with the second-tier women now, no longer serving tea but sharing it. She's renamed. This time she smiles when it's announced. She has made it through the first filter, but there's a constant shadow hanging over her. Choice does not exist here. She cannot leave. She cannot say no. And if she displeases someone powerful, especially the Validi Sultan, her training, her beauty, even her chastity won't save her. The river is always waiting, quiet, cold, final. And yet the women around her are not broken. They are proud, cunning, funny. You see them laughing during embroidery sessions, teasing each other during music practice, quoting Rumi and Hafiz like flirtation. There's a camaraderie in their confinement. Some have formed alliances, others deeper bonds. But no one says those things out loud. That's not how it's done here. One open scholarly debate that still sparks interest. Just how much autonomy did these women truly have? Some argue they were prisoners with painted faces, trained to please and discarded like ornaments. Others insist they were shrewd political players who understood that invisibility was their greatest weapon. The truth, again, is a slippery thing. One thing's for sure, these weren't helpless girls waiting for rescue. They were survivors in silk playing a long, dangerous game. You watch as the newly promoted concubine is summoned to her first formal dinner with the higher ranks. She takes a deep breath, smooths her robe, and steps into the chamber with a poise that would make you forget she once herded goats in a village you've never heard of. Tonight she'll speak sparingly, eat daintily, and offer no opinions unless asked. She will laugh at the right moments and compliment the favourite's earrings. Not too much, just enough. The Valid Sultan might not even glance at her, but that's okay. No glance means no danger. Not yet. She will survive this night, maybe even the next. And if she's lucky, she'll climb another rung on the ladder or she'll fall, because in the harem there is no standing still. It's late afternoon now, and the sun filters through the latticed windows of the harem like honey poured through lace. Everything looks golden, softened, like a painting you'd almost forget was real, if not for the tension beneath it. In the courtyard, a small group of girls sits in a circle, Not laughing, not speaking, just listening. At the centre is an older woman, her face a patchwork of fine lines, her hair pulled back beneath a silk scarf that shimmers like a crow's wing. She's speaking in a low, steady voice, and every word feels like it's being etched into the air. You've wandered into a lesson. But not the kind that's written in books or announced on schedules. This is the art of seduction, passed from lips to ears, hidden behind embroidery frames and fans. The harem may be filled with rules, hierarchy and ritual, but there's an entire underground curriculum here. The curriculum of the body, the gaze, the pause, and the perfectly timed whisper. You sit in the shade, unnoticed, watching as the older woman, likely a retired concubine who never bore a son but earned her rank, leans in closer. She holds up a lemon, just a lemon, and begins to explain how the way you peel it in front of the Sultan can say more than any poem. Quick hands mean nerves. Too slow means laziness. A steady hand, a graceful arc of peel falling into a silver dish. That's elegance. That's restraint. That's power. The girls nod, wide-eyed. Some are scribbling in tiny notebooks tucked into their sleeves. You realise that in this place, everything is symbolism. The way you hold a cup, the way you enter a room, even the way you tilt your head while listening to a story. And nowhere is that more vital than in the bedroom, or more accurately in everything that happens before the bedroom door even opens. Let's clear something up. Ottoman seduction wasn't about flashy dancing or overt sexuality. It was about building tension, mystery, and emotional resonance. You weren't supposed to pounce. You were supposed to haunt. The ideal concubine left an impression like perfume lingering after someone's left the room. Subtle, unforgettable. And how did they train for this? First, music. You had to know how to play it, sing it, and more importantly, use it. Certain songs were associated with certain moods: longing, melancholy, flirtation. Singing one tune while making eye contact could signal interest. Another could be a challenge. You learn that a slow, breathy rendition of an old Persian ballad once made the Sultan weep. That concubine. She got her own pavilion, the power of song weaponized. Then there was poetry. Memorized, yes, but also improvised. The ability to quote verses from Hafiz or Rumi at just the right moment, to turn a compliment into a double entendre, to reply to a jest with a couplet. That was seduction by intellect. A battle of wits wrapped in velvet. But the crown jewel of the curriculum? The book. No one knows who wrote it. It has no title. It isn't copied. It's whispered, passed down orally, piece by piece, like a living manuscript. The older women refer to it as the verses, and it contains the most guarded secrets of sensual practice in the palace. You catch fragments, techniques of touch, breathing rituals that heighten sensitivity, the value of eye contact held for 3 seconds, no more, no less, how to recognize signs of tension in the Sultan's body, where to press during conversation, not just his hand, but his emotions, and one eerie passage, how to survive disinterest, what to do when he forgets your name, when he doesn't summon you for months, how to remain dignified, calm, ever smiling, while slowly redirecting your power. Not every seduction ends in success, but in the harem, sometimes survival is success. A fringe fact passed around the cushions. Some concubines learn to create specific scents, blends of sweat, perfume and natural oils unique to their bodies, like a personal brand. They'd apply it only on the nights they were summoned, so if the Sultan missed the scent later, he might summon them again without even knowing why. But not every girl learned these things. Some couldn't. Some weren't allowed to, because this kind of training was reserved for the ones who showed potential, the ones the older women liked. Yes, favoritism existed even in the shadows. A good singing voice might get you noticed, but a clever compliment to the right Kalfa could get you a private lesson in pillow talk. There's a power here that isn't talked about openly. It hides in the spaces between lessons, in the way the older women guide the younger ones with such precision. Because they know something the girls don't. Not yet. They know that once you enter that bedchamber, once the Sultan's gaze falls on you, you can't go back. There's no before anymore, only the long road of after. One scholarly theory suggests that many of these techniques weren't originally Ottoman at all, but inherited from older Persian, Arab, and even Indian court traditions. There's a whole debate about how the sensual arts travelled through empires, along trade routes, in marriage trunks, tucked between pages of poetry. Some say the Ottomans absorbed it all and refined it to fit their imperial model. Others argue that the harem's central culture was uniquely homegrown, forged by centuries of palace isolation. The truth? Probably a tangled mix of both, but the effect is undeniable. The women here learn to shape themselves into living metaphors. They are the poem, the performance, the provocation, and it's exhausting. You catch one of the younger girls sneaking away from the lesson early. She walks to the edge of the garden and slumps onto a bench, her shoulders no longer upright, her gaze unfocused. Maybe it's all too much. Maybe she knows she'll never be chosen. Or maybe, just maybe, she's realised she doesn't want to be. Because here's the quiet truth that everyone in this palace eventually learns. Being desired is not the same as being free. And yet the next day she returns to the circle. She listens. She takes notes. She sings a new song with a slightly clearer voice. Because even if she doesn't want the Sultan, she knows this. To survive in the harem, you must be wanted by someone. And so, the lessons continue. The older woman smiles as she hands another girl a handful of rose petals. She says nothing, but the girl nods, understanding the unspoken message. Tonight, you'll leave a trail behind you. Not for him, for the others. Because in a place where everyone's watching, sometimes the best seduction is the one done for an audience of rivals. The palace changes at sunset. You can feel it in your chest, like a curtain being drawn over the day. The call to prayer rises over the city, echoing from every minaret, and the harem falls into a hush, not solemn exactly, but expectant, as if everyone is waiting for something. You pass through a hallway laced with gold filigree, the shadows stretching long over patterned tiles. Another night is beginning, and for one woman in particular it's not just any night. Tonight she might be chosen. Now let's talk about that choosing. Because if you're imagining the Sultan strolling through the harem like a medieval version of The Bachelor, handing out roses and winks, think again. The process was far more complicated and way more strategic. You don't just happen to end up in his bed. You're placed there, selected, prepared, and delivered like a rare treasure wrapped in silk and politics. The night starts, as many do in this world, with silence. Somewhere in the inner chambers, the chief black eunuch, the Kızlar Asa, receives a discreet message. No signature, no explanation. Just a name, or sometimes just a room number. That's all it takes. One decision scribbled in gold ink and someone's life will never be the same. That slip of paper is handed to a senior eunuch who bows without speaking and begins the silent chain of command. From there, preparations unfold like clockwork. The selected woman is fetched, bathed, dressed, perfumed, and instructed not to ask questions. She's not told why she was chosen, or how, or for how long. Sometimes the Sultan makes his decision based on memory, a face that lingered in his thoughts, a line of poetry whispered 2 weeks ago that clung to his mind like a hook. Sometimes he acts on suggestion, a eunuch's whisper, a gift from the Valid Sultan, a political calculation, and occasionally it's just curiosity. He heard she plays the oud, or walks with unusual grace, or smells like cardamom. But no one ever really knows. You see the chosen girl now. She's standing barefoot in a marbled hallway, her robe clinging to her like moonlight. Her hands are steady, but her eyes flicker with emotion she's been trained not to show. Is she nervous? Excited? Terrified? Yes, all of it. She's walked this corridor 100 times in dreams, but this is the first time it's real. 2 eunuchs flank her, silent, their faces unreadable. One carries a rosewood box containing silks and linens. The other holds a silver tray of offerings, figs, almonds, and a small carafe of spiced sherbet. These are not for her, they're part of the ritual. As she walks, she passes murals that tell stories no one ever speaks of. Scenes from distant wars, mythological birds, gardens blooming in seasons that don't exist. The imagery was meant to inspire awe, but tonight, everything feels too quiet, too deliberate. Finally, they reach the Golden Path, a narrow corridor that leads directly to the Sultan's private quarters. And here's the strange part. She doesn't walk the whole way. No. Once she reaches the beginning of the path, she's told to wait. The eunuch kneels and begins to roll out a carpet beneath her feet. Step by step, as she moves forward, the carpet is unrolled in front of her, so that her bare skin never touches the cold floor. It's symbolic, yes, but it's also a reminder. Every detail is controlled, even the ground she walks on. You might be wondering, is she allowed to decline? Could she, in theory, say no? Theoretically, maybe. In practice, never. Refusing the Sultan's summons wasn't just unthinkable, it was dangerous. It could be seen as a rejection of divine will. In the eyes of the palace, his desire was law, and you don't say no to law, you obey, or you disappear. But here's where it gets even trickier. Being chosen doesn't guarantee favour. In fact, some women, many actually, are summoned once and never again. The Sultan might lose interest, or find the conversation dull, or simply fall asleep. Is that brutal? One scholar described it as a system designed to break dreams in velvet. And yet this night could also mean everything. If she pleases him, she might be called again. If she's called again, she might be moved to better quarters. And if she becomes a regular companion, if she becomes memorable, then she might eventually earn the title of Haseki Sultan, or official consort. From there, children, power, influence, maybe even the ear of the empire. But that path is thin as thread, and full of knives. You see it in her eyes as she steps through the final archway. This isn't a walk of triumph, it's a gamble. She's stepping into a chamber that has swallowed countless women before her. Some emerged with power, some never walked out again. There's a fringe story, half gossip, half warning, about a concubine who fainted from nerves the moment she entered the Sultan's chamber. Not from fear of the man, but from the unbearable pressure of what it all meant. The Sultan, apparently amused, offered her a glass of water and sent her back to the harem. She was never summoned again. But she also wasn't punished. Rumour says she later became a poet. Privately, of course. Tonight the chosen woman doesn't faint. She breathes, once, twice, then enters. The chamber is candlelit, warm, quiet. The Sultan is not seated on a throne. He reclines on a platform of silk cushions, reading something written in Persian. He looks up slowly, studies her, and sets the page aside. No smile, no command, just a nod. That's all she needs. She kneels, not in submission, more like custom, respect. Every motion is slow, deliberate. She's not rushing, she's not shy. She's doing exactly what she's been trained to do, mirror his energy, respond without overreaching, invite without asking. He speaks first. Sometimes it's just a question. Where are you from? Do you play music? Do you enjoy poetry? This isn't foreplay, it's evaluation. The Sultan has countless options. He doesn't just want beauty, he wants something else, something hard to define, connection, stillness, presence. You realise that this moment more than anything is a test, one that can't be crammed for. You either pass or you don't. She answers softly, her voice just above a whisper. Not coy, not boastful, just real. And he listens. There is a moment, tiny, flickering, almost invisible, when the room changes. A subtle shift in the air, the tension gives way to curiosity, maybe even desire. The Sultan leans forward, says something that makes her smile. That smile is not rehearsed. The eunuchs outside will wait all night. They don't need to be told what happened. They'll know by whether she returns in the morning wearing the same robe or a new one. You turn away before the door closes, leaving them to their ancient dance. And somewhere back in the harem, 100 women pretend not to wonder who's been chosen tonight. But they all know. The door closes with a whisper, and the harem exhales. You can almost hear it. A subtle shift in energy, like the palace walls themselves are adjusting to the choice that's just been made. Somewhere, a concubine's slippers are quietly removed, a curtain drawn shut, a fig left half-eaten on a plate. For everyone else, the night continues as it always does. But for the one behind the veil of the Sultan's bedchamber, the night has just begun. So let's finally talk about what actually happens in that bed. You're probably expecting scandal, maybe even something wild and theatrical. But here's the truth, whispered behind fans and beneath layers of ritual. Royal sex in the Ottoman harem wasn't always sexy. It was formal, it was political. It was laced with etiquette, silence, and sometimes even awkwardness. And while the poets made it sound divine, the reality was often far more complicated, and sometimes just deeply weird. Let's start with the most important rule. The Sultan leads, always, in every way. That means he initiates conversation, sets the mood, chooses the rhythm, and ends the encounter when he pleases. The woman may be trained in seduction, but she doesn't make the first move unless invited. To do so unprompted would be bold at best and dangerous at worst. There's a power dynamic at play here so intense it practically hums in the air. You watch as the concubine, now seated beside the Sultan, navigates this tightrope walk. She isn't babbling or giggling or fluttering her lashes like some caricature. She's calm, present, listening, responding. Her job tonight is not to seduce in the Western sense. It's to engage, to make herself unforgettable through attention, grace, and emotional awareness. Sex comes later. First, she must make him want to stay. There's tea, sherbet, perhaps music. If she sings or plays an instrument, she might perform. Nothing dramatic, just a verse or two. He may ask about her life, or offer her a story from his own childhood. The point isn't the conversation, it's the connection, or at the very least the illusion of one. Eventually the servants withdraw, the trays are cleared, and the room dims further. The Sultan gives a signal, usually just a word or a glance, and she rises. They move to the bed, which isn't just a mattress but a full stage. High, draped, layered with cushions and lined in silk. And here's where it gets delicate. Despite all the sultry art and European paintings you've seen, Ottoman royal intimacy was structured. It wasn't some wild free-for-all. There were expectations, scripts. Physical positions were taught, yes, but so were emotional cues. If the Sultan was tired, she was to be soothing. If he was angry, calming. If he was playful, she could mirror that, but never mock. Her entire role was to amplify his mood, not alter it. Sound sterile? Sometimes it probably was, but not always. There are stories, many of them, of concubines who broke the mould. Women who made the Sultan laugh at the wrong moment, or surprised him by quoting a line of ancient Greek. One woman, it's said, earned his affection by refusing to sleep with him the first night. She told him she was unworthy. The humility struck him so deeply, he promoted her on the spot and waited 3 weeks before summoning her again. That woman? She bore him a son. Still, the majority of these nights were performances, and like any performance they had a rhythm, a beginning, a middle, and a carefully managed end. Afterward, if the Sultan is pleased, the concubine might be invited to stay longer, or not. She might be dismissed gently or sent back in silence. The eunuchs will be waiting in the hallway either way, heads bowed, ready to escort her without eye contact. No one speaks. No one asks. The next morning, if she returns to her chamber wearing a new silk robe, especially in red or green, everyone will know what happened. It's the unspoken sign of favour. She won't say a word, of course, but the other women will take note. Eyes will flicker, alliances will shift. And here's where things get particularly strange. The record is kept. A eunuch somewhere is documenting which women spend which nights with the Sultan. Not for gossip, for bloodlines, for protocol. Because if she conceives, and many hope she would, that record will prove the legitimacy of the child. Which leads us to the real purpose of many of these late-night rendezvous, dynasty. Sex for the Sultan wasn't just a pleasure, it was a political act. Every encounter had the potential to produce a prince, and every prince was a potential heir. That's why the palace was obsessed with timing, ovulation, and subtle forms of fertility management. Here's a fringe fact that'll stay with you. Palace physicians sometimes analysed the colour of a concubine's urine before she was summoned. Why? To determine fertility. If her body seemed ready, she might be pushed to the front of the line, not for love, for genetics. Another layer of control. The Sultan didn't sleep with multiple women in one night. That was frowned upon. Each encounter was meant to be focused, personal, which sounds noble until you realise how many women were waiting, watching, hoping for their turn. Some waited years, others never got one. And if the night didn't go well, that depended. Some women were simply forgotten, moved to lower quarters, reassigned to other tasks. Others became pawns in diplomatic marriages. A few were quietly sent to the old palace, a dusty lesser residence across the city where former favourites were exiled with generous stipends but no purpose. A velvet prison. The worst fate, indifference. There's an open scholarly debate about how much consent these women really had. Were they victims? Agents of their own ambition? Both? Neither? Some argue the structure itself removed all autonomy. Others say the concubines had more power than anyone gives them credit for, able to influence foreign policy, the sultan's mood, even succession. It's hard to say. The truth is lost somewhere in layers of silk and silence. Tonight the woman returns to her chamber just before dawn. Her posture is the same, her face unreadable, but her robe is new. Pale lavender, embroidered with tiny silver tulips. That's all anyone needs to see. A few girls glance at her. One looks away too quickly. Another lowers her eyes and smiles faintly. No one says a word. Later the valid sultan will be informed, not because she asked, but because she always knows. If she's pleased with the choice, she'll say nothing. If she isn't, well, you'll feel it soon enough. In the meantime, the chosen woman lays back on her cushions and closes her eyes. Not to sleep, but to replay every second. What he said, how he looked at her, whether he touched her hand before she left. Because tomorrow, she'll have to decide what to do with the memory. The morning comes with birdsong and the slow clatter of silver trays being prepared in the palace kitchens. The harem wakes gradually, not to alarms or commands, but to soft footsteps and the low rustle of robes. Everything here is designed to avoid sudden movement. But one sound cuts through the usual calm like a blade, the chime of a bell, light, sharp, and impossible to ignore. You recognize that sound. It's the call for verification. Everyone in the room freezes, even those pretending to be asleep. The girl in the lavender robe, still lying on her cushions, opens her eyes, but not wide. She's already preparing for what comes next, because in the Ottoman harem, sex wasn't just intimacy, it was documentation, and the morning after a night with the Sultan didn't begin with breakfast in bed. It began with proof, specifically virginity verification. Let's take a breath here, because yes, this part is disturbing, painfully invasive. You won't find it glamorized in romantic novels or Orientalist paintings, but it was a very real and ritualized part of life in the imperial harem. For first-time partners of the Sultan, the expectation was that she arrive untouched, and after the night ended, the palace wanted evidence. The eunuch appears at the doorway, not looking at anyone but clearly waiting. The concubine stands slowly, her face still unreadable. She doesn't seem afraid, but not because this isn't a violation. She's just prepared. Like everything else in this world, even intimacy has a protocol. She follows him down the corridor into a small chamber adjacent to the Sultan's quarters, a sterile room lined with marble and ivory cabinets. Inside, a matron midwife waits. Not with kindness, necessarily, but with cold professionalism. Her job isn't to console, it's to certify. The examination is quick, clinical, impersonal, a check for injury, blood, signs of sexual activity. In some cases, a cloth, delicately referred to in records as the silk, was presented to the valid sultan herself, not because she needed to know, but because she must know. This was a world where reputation was currency, and virginity was wealth. You might ask, what if the woman wasn't a virgin? What if she'd lied? Well, let's just say the consequences range from quiet exile to sudden accidents. One story, whispered but never confirmed, tells of a concubine who faked her way through the system, until the Sultan noticed a faint scar on her inner thigh that didn't match the story she'd told. She was never seen again. And what about staged virginity? Yes, it happened. There are tales, fringe, rare and debated, of concubines using animal blood or thin membranes made of fish skin to simulate the physical proof. Some claim eunuchs were in on it, bribed to look the other way. Others argue these stories were more likely invented to discredit rivals. Either way, the fact they existed at all tells you something. Even more chilling? The Sultan himself didn't always want virgins. Some preferred experience, conversation, women who could match his intellect rather than tremble beneath it. But the system didn't care what he wanted. It demanded a ritual, and rituals don't change for taste. You're probably wondering how such an invasive custom survived in a space that otherwise taught such subtlety, grace, and illusion. The answer is control. In a place where women were trained to perform, to withhold, to manipulate, this was the Empire's way of reclaiming power, of saying, "We still see you." After the examination, the concubine is bathed again, not by servants, but by elder women, those who've been through it themselves. This isn't for cleanliness, it's symbolic, a kind of rebirth. Last night she was a girl. Now she's something else, not quite a consort, not yet a mother, but no longer anonymous. She's given a new robe, this time white, and returned to her quarters with a small plate of sweets and spiced tea. Not a reward, just custom. Around her the harem hums quietly. Eyes flick in her direction but avoid direct contact. Everyone's waiting to see what happens next. Will she be called again? Will the Valid Sultan summon her? Will she be moved to better chambers, given jewellery, a servant of her own? The answer comes later that day, in the form of a delicate pouch placed beside her pillow. Inside, a gold coin and a silk sash, dyed with the colour of the Sultan's choice. Deep green, meaning he was pleased but not yet smitten. That's how it starts. One coin, one sash. If she's called again, there'll be more. A whole collection of colours and gifts like a coded love letter, written in fabric and metal. And then comes the waiting. This is the part no one trains for. The endless days of silence, not knowing if he'll call you again, if he even remembers, if someone else has taken your place already. You see her now, sitting by the window, looking out at the same garden she's walked through every day for months. But now everything feels different. There's a story, passed down from concubine to concubine, about a woman who spent a single night with the Sultan and waited 7 years for another. She never left the harem, never fell from favour, but was never called again. She lived in a room lined with books, refused to speak to anyone under 30, and was eventually buried with a single sentence carved on her tomb. Once chosen. Open scholarly debate still lingers around the psychological impact of this system. Some argue the harem was emotionally brutal, designed to keep women constantly uncertain, always hoping, always trying to please. Others say it created a rare kind of resilience, women who could adapt, strategize, and rise despite impossible odds. Because here's the thing, even a failed night didn't necessarily mean failure. Not if you played it right. A woman could pivot, reinvent, charm the Valid Sultan, befriend a powerful eunuch, develop an impeccable embroidery reputation. Seduction here came in many forms, and longevity was often more powerful than lust. You walk past her chamber again hours later. The food on her tray remains untouched. The sweets have melted slightly, and the tea is cold. But the silk sash has been folded neatly and placed beside her pillow. She's not giving up. Not yet. Because she knows that the path to power in the harem is long, and often it begins not with passion, but with endurance. The scent of sandalwood hangs heavy in the corridor as you pass through the Hall of the Mothers, a quiet stretch of the harem where time seems to move differently, slower, heavier. Here, the atmosphere is thick with power that doesn't need to speak its name. These aren't just concubines anymore. These are the women who did the impossible. They bore the Sultan's children, and in doing so, they stepped out of anonymity and into a world of real influence. Welcome to the pregnancy power play. It starts with a missed cycle, or maybe just a feeling, an odd weight, a subtle nausea, a softness in the eyes. But no one says it out loud. Not yet. Because pregnancy in the harem isn't just personal, it's political. If a concubine becomes pregnant by the Sultan, she enters a realm far beyond silk robes and scented baths. She becomes the mother of a potential heir, the woman from last night, the one who returned with a pale lavender robe and a green sash. She's now entering that stage of uncertainty, the waiting. Not for another summons, not yet, but for something more permanent to take root. She's been moved to a slightly larger room, given a private maid. Her meals are now inspected by 2 eunuchs instead of 1, not because anyone likes her more, but because now she's valuable in a different way. In the imperial harem, pregnancy wasn't just celebrated, it was weaponized. A concubine who bore a child, especially a son, gained immediate protection. She could no longer be dismissed, traded, or quietly eliminated. She now had the empire inside her, literally. The phrase they used was Kaidenluk Kazander. She has won womanhood. And with that came privileges, more servants, more elaborate clothing, her own courtyard in some cases, and most importantly, access. She could now request audiences with the Valid Sultan. She could make small, polite requests, maybe a change in her chamber's lighting, a new book of poetry, a specific blend of pomegranate sherbet she craved. And these requests, once trivial, now carried weight. Because everyone around her knew that if she bore a son, she wouldn't just be a mother, she'd be a queen maker. But don't think for a second that her position is secure. Not yet. Because the harem had an unspoken truth. Pregnancy is not power. Birth is. And even then, only if the child survives. You watch her now as she's seated in a corner garden, fanned by her maid, nibbling at pistachios and figs, her eyes distant. She doesn't look triumphant. She looks cautious. Because for all the ceremony around impending motherhood, the palace is dangerous for the unborn. Not by accident either. There are whispers, always whispers, of jealous concubines who slipped herbal teas into drinks. Subtle tisanes with names like sleep flower and black fennel. Nothing traceable. Just a little stomach pain, a little blood. No one asks questions, no one points fingers. Everyone mourns politely and moves on. The harem walls are lined with smiles, but some of them are knives. To protect herself, the expectant mother is assigned a watchwoman, often an older woman who has raised children of her own and knows the signs of trouble. Her bedding is changed daily. Her food is tasted. Her bath water is tested for temperature. And still, accidents happen. One fringe fact. There was a custom in which pregnant concubines would sleep with a small silver dagger under their pillow, not to defend themselves, but as a symbolic promise that they would protect their unborn child even in dreams. And what about the Sultan? Is he involved? Sometimes. Some sultans showed intense interest in their unborn children, sending gifts, visiting the mother, consulting physicians. Others, distant, distracted, too consumed by politics, war, or other women to pay much attention. To them, a concubine's pregnancy was a matter of logistics, not emotion. Still, even the most indifferent sultan would be briefed. If a pregnancy was confirmed, he'd be informed immediately. He might send a gift, a bolt of silk, a necklace, a handwritten note. The concubine might receive it with trembling hands or barely concealed annoyance. Depends on the woman, because by this point she has her own agenda. You see, if she's smart, and most of them are, she's already begun planning. If it's a boy, she'll need to secure allies, begin relationships with key eunuchs, teachers, guards, lay the groundwork for her son's future palace education. Because when the boy turns 16, he'll be sent to govern a province, and if he does well, he might return to rule the empire. And she'll become Valid Sultan, the most powerful woman in the Islamic world. But let's not skip ahead, because there's still a long road between pregnancy and power, and it's filled with politics, protocol, and paranoia. Another scholarly point of debate: did women ever fake pregnancies to buy themselves time or status? Some records suggest yes. Clever manipulation of body language, clothing, and diet. With enough allies, a woman could maintain the illusion of pregnancy for several months, just long enough to climb a few rungs higher before the truth caught up. Of course, the risks were enormous. Getting caught meant disgrace, or worse. There's one case, buried deep in the records, of a concubine accused of such deceit. She was quietly removed from the palace under the cover of night. Some say she became a servant in the old palace. Others say she fell ill on the boat ride across the Bosphorus. You can guess what that means. But when a pregnancy was real and the child was born healthy, everything changed. You watch the moment when a harem doctor, an old man with a bent spine and clouded eyes, emerges from the birthing chamber. He doesn't speak, but he nods once to the waiting eunuch. A ripple of quiet spreads through the harem like heat through water. It's a boy. The Valida Sultan is the first to be informed. She will visit the new mother personally, not with affection, there's no hugging, but with formality. A gift, a blessing, a warning. The concubine is now a sultana. Her son is now a shehzadeh, a prince. From this day forward, she's no longer just a lover. She's a mother of the empire's bloodline. She's entitled to more servants, better food, layers of protection. She'll be moved to the privy chambers, closer to the heart of the palace. She'll begin wearing darker, richer colours: wine, forest green, deep violet. The pastels of seduction are gone. She doesn't need to be chosen anymore. She already won. But she also just stepped into a new kind of battlefield. Because now, her enemy isn't obscurity. It's competition. Other mothers, other sons, and eventually the rules of fratricide that govern imperial succession will come for them all. But that's another storm entirely. Tonight she holds her newborn in her arms, her expression unreadable. Is she happy? Relieved? Already plotting? Yes, all of it. There's a saying in the harem passed quietly from woman to woman. It's not the sultan who rules the harem, it's jealousy. And tonight, that truth hangs in the air like a thundercloud waiting to crack open. You feel it in the cold stares exchanged in the garden, the tightly clenched hands beneath layers of silk, the sudden silence that falls when a favourite passes by. The sultan may be the object of desire, but the true tension lives among the women themselves, because when one woman rises, others fall, and when one bears a son, the rest feel the ground shift beneath them. Jealousy in the harem isn't loud. It doesn't scream or shatter glass. It smiles sweetly, whispers softly, and poisons slowly, metaphorically, and sometimes literally. You pass through a tiled hallway, cool and shadowed, and hear laughter echoing from one of the bath chambers. But you know better than to believe it. That laughter is just part of the performance. The real drama happens behind closed doors, or behind veils. Let's talk about the darker side of harem politics, the side that doesn't get embroidered into cushions or painted onto romantic canvases. This is where rivalry becomes survival, and survival means being one step ahead of every other beautiful, talented and deadly woman in the palace. You see it unfold now, subtle and terrifying. A concubine, let's call her Yasemin, used to be the favourite. She had the sultan's attention for months. She received silks, pearls, poems in his own hand. Everyone envied her, until last week when a younger woman arrived, sharp, graceful, trained in both poetry and the oud. The sultan summoned her 3 nights in a row. Yasemin hasn't been called since. She pretends not to care, but today the young rival woke up with swollen eyes and a rash across her chest. The palace doctors say it's nothing serious, just a reaction to a certain flower placed in her room. But everyone knows flowers don't arrive without intent. This is how battles are fought here. Quietly, indirectly. Through perfumes laced with irritants, pillows sprinkled with itching powder, rumours whispered into the ears of influential eunuchs. There's a whole category of harem knowledge devoted to this. The subtle art of sabotage. It's taught just like music or poetry, but only to those who've earned trust. Jealousy can also twist the hierarchy in invisible ways. The Valid Sultan, for instance, has her favourites and her targets. She might grow fond of one concubine not for her beauty, but for her obedience. She might despise another for being too clever, too confident, too well loved. A word from the Valid is enough to end a woman's chances forever, or to destroy her slowly, over time. There's a story, half whispered, half sworn, of a concubine who was rising fast. She'd been favoured 6 times in a month. Rumours said the Sultan was preparing to name her Haseki. Then, without warning, she was sent away. No explanation, no accusations, just gone. Some say the Valide found a letter she'd written, unflattering, sarcastic, a little too honest. Others say she simply wore the wrong colour in front of the wrong person. That's how fragile favour is in this world. And that's how dangerous jealousy can become. And it's not just about the Sultan's attention, it's about resources, better rooms, better servants, more food, access to certain corridors, access to the power brokers, the senior eunuchs, the kalfas, even the scribes. Everything in the harem is a limited commodity, and when one woman gains, someone else loses. A fringe practice? Some women are said to have bribed servants to swap teacups, just in case a rival tried to slip something into theirs. Another trick, scratching a secret symbol onto the bottom of your plate so you can spot it if someone tries to give you food meant for someone else. Paranoia isn't a flaw here, it's a survival skill. And the most dangerous jealousy of all, the kind that brews between mothers. Because once children are involved, everything escalates. A concubine whose son is strong, clever or favoured is automatically a threat to every other mother in the harem. Their sons are now competitors in a game that ends with only one winner. You see it now in the garden, 2 mothers seated apart pretending not to notice each other. One son just received a new tutor, a sign of future grooming for leadership. The other's son, older but often sick, was recently demoted to a less impressive apartment. Both women are calm, smiling, but the tension between them is thick as smoke. It wasn't always this way. Or maybe it was, but less lethal. Earlier in Ottoman history, sultans had multiple sons, all raised together in the palace. But by the time the empire reached its golden age, a chilling tradition had emerged: fratricide. When a new sultan rose to power, his brothers were often killed, strangled with silken cords in a grim ritual meant to prevent civil war. This meant that every mother knew, deep down, that her child's survival might mean another child's death, that her own power came at the cost of someone else's life. That's why jealousy in the harem isn't just petty, it's existential. Scholars still debate how widespread the poisonings and sabotages really were. Some argue it was rare, exaggerated by European observers who loved to paint the East as exotic and dangerous. Others point to the consistency of these stories across generations and empires. The truth? Somewhere in the middle. Not every concubine was a scheming villain. But neither was this a sorority of supportive sisters. And yet, somehow, the women endured it, learned to navigate it, even mastered it. Because jealousy, once understood, became a tool. If you could anticipate it, you could control it, use it, twist it into strategy. You watch as Yasemin, the fallen favourite, enters the bath chamber. Her posture is perfect, her robe immaculate. She chats with two other women, compliments one's earrings, asks about another's embroidery. She's smiling, she's glowing, but you know what's coming. That night she returns to her room and finds a gift box on her bed. Inside, dried orange blossoms and a bracelet she once admired, both signs of forgiveness from the Valid Sultan. She's been given another chance, not at love, at relevance. Jealousy took her down, and now, with just the right smile and a few whispered favours, she's using it to rise again. This is the alchemy of the harem, turning fear into leverage, turning rivalry into revival, and always watching your back. Evening has fallen again over Topkapi Palace, and the moonlight pools across the tiled courtyards like spilled milk. You wander through the garden of pomegranate trees, the air sharp with the scent of winter citrus and the faint musk of jasmine, and for a moment everything seems calm, too calm. Because while the Sultan's official choices and maternal power struggles are whispered about openly, there's a second layer to the harem no one talks about during daylight. It's the part that lives between curtains and glances, between baths and braids, between women. Tonight, we're peeling back the silk on forbidden loves. The harem, by design, is a world of women, hundreds of them, living together, training together, bathing together, sleeping in chambers that echo with laughter, tension, and yes, intimacy. Most were brought here young, still girls, and matured in the shadow of palace walls with only each other for comfort, for companionship, for human warmth. So it should come as no surprise that some bonds formed beyond friendship. You see it now in the way one concubine reaches for another's hand, holding it just a moment too long, in the way they brush each other's hair at night, knees touching, faces close, a kiss on the forehead, sure, but sometimes lower. A touch meant to comfort, sometimes meaning much more. It was subtle, always, hidden, but deeply real. Was it sexual? Sometimes. But often, it was something harder to define, a kind of emotional intimacy born of shared confinement, shared danger, shared longing. When you're constantly being measured by your value to a man you might never meet, the idea of loving someone who understands your world perfectly, that becomes irresistible. Of course, none of this was officially allowed. The harem's laws were clear, no unauthorized physical intimacy of any kind, especially between women. But enforcement? That was another matter. Unless you were caught in a compromising position, and even then, depending on who caught you. Most of these relationships lived in a grey area, tolerated as long as they stayed discreet. There's one story, almost certainly true, of a concubine who faked illness just to be moved to the infirmary, where her beloved was assigned as a nurse. For a week they exchanged soft words and secret touches between herbal compresses and bowls of barley water. When she recovered, she wept openly, not from grief, but from losing that fleeting privacy. Fringe fact, there were codes, whole systems of signals developed to communicate affection under the watchful eyes of the eunuchs and the kalfas. A comb left on a pillow could mean, I miss you. A sash tied a certain way on a laundry line meant, I'll wait for you tonight. And a verse from a love poem read aloud during music practice might hold meanings no man in the palace could decode. But sometimes these bonds went too far, too visible, too loud. You pass by a chamber now, long abandoned but still remembered. It belonged to two concubines whose affection became too obvious. They slept side by side, ate every meal together, refused suitors. One was even said to have rejected a summon from the Sultan claiming a headache. The classic excuse, ancient and effective, only to be seen sneaking back into the other's quarters that same night. They were separated, one sent to the old palace, the other mysteriously ill just weeks later. No one talks about it, but no one forgets either. The open scholarly debate here is whether such relationships were commonplace or exceptional. Some argue the emotional intensity of the harem, its isolation, its competitive atmosphere, and its constant surveillance, naturally created the conditions for same-sex intimacy. Others say that most such relationships were fleeting, adolescent, and rarely involved physical contact. But all agree on one thing. These women loved each other in ways history has tried to erase, and it wasn't just romantic love. There were other forbidden relationships too, friendships that blurred into loyalty, loyalty that blurred into obsession. Older concubines sometimes grew maternal attachments to their protégés, protecting them fiercely, even at the cost of their own rank. One famed example: a senior Khalfa once refused to recommend a favoured trainee to the Sultan, not because she thought the girl unworthy, but because she feared what the palace would do to her once she was chosen. That act of defiance cost her her title, but not her self-respect. And then there were the whispers of even more dangerous relationships, ones between concubines and men not named Sultan. A young eunuch who lingered too long by a chamber door, a gardener who met a girl too often beneath the lemon trees. These were rarer and punished with shocking severity. A concubine caught with a man was often banished immediately, her fate sealed in silence. The man, executed, usually by drowning, a silk bag over the head, a quiet splash in the Bosphorus, no trial, no burial, just gone. One fringe tale claims that a concubine and a young scribe carried on an affair for 4 years, using poetry as their secret code. She would slip verses into his ink blotter, and he would respond with marginalia in palace documents only she would read. It ended, of course, in heartbreak. He was caught. She was spared, only because she was pregnant with the Sultan's child at the time, but she never spoke again. Her silence became legendary. They called her the ghost of the garden. You think of her now as you pass through a moonlit hallway, the marble floors cold beneath your steps. Maybe she's still here, in some way, in the air, in the stone. Maybe all the women who dared to love outside the rules left something behind. A whisper, a warning, a memory. Because even in a palace where every gaze is managed, every word rehearsed, every relationship monitored, the heart still rebels. You pause by a chamber where 2 women sit close together, a shared embroidery hoop between them. They're not touching, not saying much, but the space between them hums with something you can't quite name. Tomorrow they'll play their roles, they'll smile for the valide, they'll bow at the right time, but tonight they are simply themselves. And in a world where you can be punished for desire, sometimes that's the most radical act of all. It's midday now, and the courtyard glows with the kind of brutal, sun-bleached light that makes everything seem sharper than it really is. You're sitting by the fountain in the courtyard of the concubines, where girls lounge on cushions beneath hanging fabrics that billow gently in the breeze. It looks like a dream, a watercolour of leisure and grace, but don't let the delicate postures and lazy fans fool you. You've just stepped into the middle of one of the most deeply entrenched lies ever sold to the Western world, the myth of the harem. You know the one. Bare-breasted women draped in gauze, feeding each other grapes, lounging on velvet divans, always somehow oiled up and suggestively bored. European artists of the 18th and 19th centuries practically made a genre out of this nonsense, filling galleries with paintings of sexualized fantasies that had more in common with brothels than Ottoman reality. They painted harems as playgrounds of pleasure, stocked with exotic, half-naked women lounging around just waiting for a man to enter. Spoiler alert! That man was almost always imagined as French. And while the fantasy has persisted, fueled by novels, films, perfume ads, and a million bad costume party choices, the truth is very different. If you dropped any of those European painters into the real Ottoman harem for 5 minutes, they'd probably faint, or get forcibly escorted out by eunuchs, or worse. Because the harem wasn't a pleasure den, it was a fortress, a tightly controlled, highly stratified political institution where the stakes were life and death, and where sexuality was just one sliver of a far more complex machine. You hear a group of girls nearby laughing, their voices high and light, but there's a sharpness underneath. They're discussing a portrait that just arrived at court, sent by a French ambassador, a gift to the Sultan. It's a painting of a harem girl, nearly nude, reclining in a fantasy garden. They're mocking it, of course. One calls it anatomically confused. Another mutters, "If I lay like that for 10 minutes, my spine would snap." Because they know the truth. None of them has ever posed like that. And if they had, it wouldn't have been for art. It would have been for war. And the Western obsession with the harem wasn't just about titillation. It was about power and projection. By turning the harem into a symbol of exotic excess and female submission, Europeans got to flatter themselves. Look how barbaric the East is, they'd say, while simultaneously drooling over the very fantasy they claimed to condemn. The harem became both a cautionary tale and a private dreamscape, one that conveniently ignored the actual voices and lives of the women inside it. One scholar referred to this as the fetishized veil, a way of imagining Muslim women as both hypersexual and completely inaccessible, all at once. Covered, hidden, unknowable, but definitely into you, is projection at its most colonial. But what was really going on behind those walls? You already know much of it. The hierarchy, the training, the politics, the razor-sharp rivalries. But perhaps the biggest myth to bust is the idea that the harem was full of idle women waiting to be entertained. The truth, they were working, constantly. From the lowest servants to the Valid Sultan herself, every woman had duties, learning languages, practicing music, weaving embroidery that would be gifted to foreign dignitaries, managing inventories of textiles and jewellery, preparing for diplomatic visits. Some concubines even ran estates on behalf of the palace, overseeing land holdings and income like miniature CEOs. The Sultan's favourite consorts weren't picked for their curves. They were chosen for their ability to run a small empire and look flawless while doing it. The fringe fact. One concubine once compiled an inventory of spices for the palace kitchen so detailed and accurate it became the official template for all future audits, and was still being used decades after her death. Sexy? Not particularly. Impressive? Absolutely. There's also the myth that the harem women were sexually available to any man who entered. Again, laughable. The only men allowed inside were eunuchs, and even they followed a strict protocol. The Sultan? Sure, he had access, but even his interactions with the women were controlled, timed and documented. No one was wandering in to choose a favourite for the night like they were picking desserts from a tray. And let's not forget how hard it was to even get to the Sultan. Most women in the harem never once laid eyes on him. They might train for years and die without ever being summoned. There's a strange loneliness in that. You spend your entire life preparing to be a man's companion, and he never even learns your name. Contrast that with the paintings. Every woman is looking directly at the viewer, inviting, teasing, displayed. In reality, concubines were trained not to make eye contact with men unless instructed. In fact, there was an entire etiquette around gaze, posture and speech. The women of the harem weren't reclining. They were performing, and they were watched, all the time, but not for pleasure, for protocol, for threats, for alliances. It's this false overlap between watched and desired that fueled the Western imagination, as if surveillance and sexuality were the same thing. They weren't. Being watched in the harem meant you were being measured, for grace, poise, value, not enjoyed. You glance around now and see one of the older concubines shaking her head as she folds a letter. She's read the ambassador's note that came with the painting, something about paying tribute to Ottoman beauty. She mutters something in Turkish that roughly translates to, "If beauty was enough, half this palace would be dead by now." And she's right, because beauty was just the entry fee. Survival required strategy, advancement required intellect, and power, that came only to the few who knew how to bend the rules without breaking them. So the next time you see a painting of a bare-chested woman lounging under palm trees, staring longingly into space with zero visible muscle tone or personality, remember, you're not looking at history. You're looking at a fantasy of the frightened West, trying to make sense of a world it couldn't control, and turning it into a fetish when it failed. The real harem wasn't a painting. It was a battlefield in velvet. And the women, warriors with fans in one hand and knives behind their backs. The storm comes just after dusk. Thick clouds roll in over the Bosphorus, swallowing the stars, and for a few precious hours, even Topkapi Palace seems hushed under the weight of thunder. Rain taps against the latticed windows, a rhythmic drumming that drowns out the usual gossip and song. In the harem, Women retreat indoors, slippers silent on the marble as oil lamps flicker to life. Tonight, the harem is quieter than usual, not because of the storm outside, but because of the one brewing within. You see, not all sultans were created equal, and not all of them were strong enough to resist the trap of the harem. You've heard the phrase before, whispered like a curse or a warning, he was swallowed by the harem. It doesn't mean he died here, it means he disappeared, not literally, but in spirit, in duty, in discipline. A sultan consumed by the constant seduction, the politics, the flattery. A sultan who stopped ruling the empire and started ruling the rotation of his lovers, and when that happened, everyone suffered. Tonight you're thinking about one of them in particular. His name was Ibrahim I, known more famously as Ibrahim the Mad. And if you think that's just an unkind nickname invented centuries later, well, he absolutely earned it. He spent his early life in forced confinement, locked in the cafes, the gilded cage within the palace where princes were kept, isolated to prevent coups. No fresh air, no education, no visitors beyond a handful of guards and tutors. By the time his older brother Murad IV died, Ibrahim was the only surviving male heir, and a psychological mess. It took weeks to convince him he wasn't being tricked into stepping out of the cafes to be executed. When he finally did emerge, squinting into the sunlight like a mole dragged out of the earth, he had no idea how to govern. What he did know, women, and he leaned hard into that knowledge. Within weeks, Ibrahim tripled the size of the harem, demanding new concubines be brought in from all over the empire. He developed elaborate tastes, blondes from the Balkans, dark-eyed Persians, redheads from Georgia. He reportedly became obsessed with one concubine who was so large she had to be rolled into his chamber on a carpet. Not shaming her body, this is exactly what he wanted. Her nickname, Shekapera, or sweet pastry. To be clear, nothing wrong with preference. But this wasn't just about attraction. It was excess without limit. Ibrahim would summon a dozen women a night, not to speak with them, but to watch them fight over his slippers, or to play strange invented games involving feathers and oil. He wasn't seducing, he was drowning. And meanwhile, the empire was coming apart. Military campaigns failed, corruption soared, trade routes fell into disarray. But inside the harem, everything looked golden. The women were fed, pampered, gilded in jewels. One account describes Ibrahim's concubines throwing coins from balconies into the gardens, just to watch servants scramble. Another claims he gifted an entire island to a concubine as a token of affection. Whether or not the island ever existed is debatable, but the sentiment is real. Power had shifted, and not in a good way. Now, to be fair, Ibrahim wasn't the only sultan seduced by his own harem. There's Selim II, known as Selim the Sot, who reportedly drank more wine than he ordered troops, and left most state matters to his favourite concubine and the Grand Vizier, and Mustafa I, who became sultan twice and was deposed both times, largely because he couldn't stop talking to animals and staring at walls. But Ibrahim stands out because the damage he did was so dramatic, so reckless, and so soaked in sexual obsession. He even attempted to drown 280 of his concubines in the Bosphorus. Yes, drown, after suspecting one of them had committed adultery. Spoiler, she probably didn't. A few were rescued by fishermen. The rest, gone. It was the Valide Sultan, his own mother, who finally had enough. She orchestrated his deposition and eventually his execution. His harem, once bursting with jewels and silk and laughter, went quiet. Many concubines were sent to the old palace, others faded into anonymity. The storm passed, but the damage was done. And here's the debate. Was it truly the harem that destroyed him? Or was he already broken when he entered it? Some scholars argue that the structure of the cafes, the decades-long psychological isolation, warped these men so severely that once they were handed absolute power, they simply unravelled. The harem wasn't the disease, it was the trigger. Others say it's more complicated, that the harem by its very design offered too much temptation, too many distractions, and not enough accountability. A young man raised in velvet, surrounded by women trained to please him, fed with sherbets and poetry, praised like a god. How could he not lose sight of his duties? You think about the concubines now, the ones caught in the slipstream of a sultan's downfall. Some might have enjoyed the chaos, yes. Some thrived. But most, they were just doing what they'd been trained to do: entertain, adapt, survive. Imagine being summoned, not for conversation or companionship, but to dance on command while the Sultan giggled into his sherbet. Imagine being valued not for your intelligence or your artistry or your wit, but for your ability to distract a broken man from his madness. That's not romance. That's labour. One fringe story tells of a concubine who kept a secret journal during Ibrahim's reign. She wrote poetry not for the Sultan, but for herself. Quiet, aching verses about missing silence, about longing for a voice that wasn't being performed, about remembering who she was before her name was changed. The journal was never found, of course, but sometimes the older women still quote her lines. I wore pearls in the morning and wept into rose water at night. And tonight, as the rain softens and the wind picks up, the women of the harem gather in their rooms. There's a quiet understanding that the Sultan, whoever he is now, is in a dark mood. He hasn't called anyone. He hasn't spoken. The palace is holding its breath. And you realise something chilling. When a Sultan falls, he doesn't fall alone. He takes hundreds of women down with him. Morning breaks over the palace with the usual fanfare, the distant call to prayer, the flutter of pigeons taking flight above the domes, and the muted clinking of breakfast trays being arranged in the harem kitchens. But today the air carries something else. Whispers. They move like smoke through every tiled corridor and silk-curtained room. Because something extraordinary has happened. The kind of thing that rewrites the rules of the game. A concubine has not only been summoned again and again, she's just been named Haseki Sultan. And not just any concubine. A foreigner. A woman who came from outside the empire, outside the faith, outside the expected script. Her name before she arrived was Alexandra Lisovska, born in what is now Ukraine, taken by Tatar raiders, sold into slavery, and brought to the Ottoman court. Here she was renamed Hurrem, meaning the cheerful one. But history would know her by another title, Roxolana. And she didn't just bend the rules of the harem, she shattered them. You're in the harem's hall of the favourites now, watching, as the women bustle around in not quite controlled chaos. Hurrem's chambers are being redecorated, her attendance doubled, and the ceremonial musicians have already been rehearsing for hours. No one saw this coming, at least not so soon. There are girls who've waited years for a second glance from the Sultan. Hurrem? She arrived, smiled, and stayed. It wasn't just her beauty. Everyone agrees she was attractive, but plenty of beautiful women had been passed over before. It was her wit, her confidence, her refusal to melt into the background. She was playful and sharp-tongued, reportedly once teasing the Sultan by asking, "How can a man so powerful be so easily pleased by grapes?" He laughed, and then asked to see her again, and again, until she became not just a favourite but his only consort. This was unprecedented. Ottoman sultans kept multiple women in rotation for political and practical reasons, spreading alliances, securing multiple heirs, ensuring no one concubine held too much influence. Hurrem ended that system. She made herself indispensable. The Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent no less, freed her, then married her, breaking centuries of a royal tradition. This wasn't just scandalous, it was revolutionary. The harem split in half over it. Some women adored Hurrem, seeing her rise as proof that intelligence and charm could still win over rank and bloodline. Others loathed her, calling her a foreign witch, accusing her of using sorcery and manipulative prayer to seduce the Sultan. One woman even claimed Hurrem had cursed her with a glance during a bath. You can guess how that ended. She was reassigned to a distant provincial estate and never heard from again. Hurrem didn't just secure a marriage, she bore the Sultan 6 children, including multiple sons, and instead of letting them be raised in the traditional palace system, she stayed involved in their lives, writing letters, overseeing their education, forging alliances. You read one of those letters now, copied into a private journal by a eunuch who had served her. In it she writes to Suleiman while he's away at war. Her tone is affectionate but calculated. She praises his victories but also reminds him to eat. She includes a poem, then a request. A certain advisor she doesn't trust has been whispering too much. She advises caution. It's diplomacy disguised as pillow talk. The real shock? The Sultan listens. This was Hurrem's genius. She understood that to survive she couldn't just be a lover or a mother. She had to be a political player, and she played the long game better than anyone else. Some historians argue she's the true founder of what would later be known as the Sultanate of Women, a 130-year period in Ottoman history when female members of the royal family effectively ran the empire through their sons and husbands, and it all started with her. A girl stolen from a village, renamed, trained, and dropped into the harem like a spark into dry straw. And if you think her story ended in marriage and motherhood, think again. Hurrem oversaw massive charitable projects. She commissioned mosques, schools, soup kitchens and hospitals, not just in Istanbul but across the empire. Her public image became a careful blend of maternal generosity and queenly authority. And behind the scenes, she was deeply involved in court politics, often clashing with Suleiman's Grand Vizier, and even allegedly orchestrating the downfall of his firstborn son from another concubine. Was she ruthless? Maybe. But so was everyone else in her position. There's an open debate among scholars even now. Was Hurrem a power-hungry manipulator, or a brilliant strategist surviving in a system designed to crush her? Was she the villain of the harem, or its greatest success story? The answer probably is both. You walk past her old chambers now lavishly refurbished as a kind of museum wing, and imagine her sitting cross-legged on a cushion, watching the door, knowing that every smile she gave could shift the balance of power, that a single word to the right eunuch could elevate someone or erase them, and yet those close to her said she loved the Sultan, not just as a duty but deeply. Their letters are full of longing, inside jokes, shared memories. One includes a drawing of a flower, no message, just the bloom. It's intimate, honest, vulnerable. It's not what you expect from a woman accused of murder, manipulation and seduction on an imperial scale. But maybe that's the point. Hurrem was complicated, and she paved the way for other complicated women. You see her legacy in every corner of the palace now, in the new concubines who read poetry a little too well, in the quiet glances exchanged between favourites, in the smiles that carry hidden meanings. Because thanks to Hurrem, they know that love is not just a distraction. It can be a weapon, it can change dynasties, and it can turn a girl stolen from the steppe into the most powerful woman in the world. The scent of cloves drifts through the harem tonight, warm and sharp, clinging to the air like a spell. You follow it through a narrow corridor lit by oil lamps, past doors that conceal 1,000 whispered dreams, until you reach a room unlike the others. Inside there are no divans, no embroidered cushions, no perfumes on display, at least not the ones you'd recognise. Instead, shelves line the walls, each one stacked with ceramic jars, dried herbs and tiny scrolls tied with gold thread. You've found the harem's hidden pharmacy, a place where power is brewed in secret, drop by drop. Welcome to the world of erotic medicine and love potions. You might be surprised to learn that sexuality in the Ottoman harem wasn't just emotional or even physical, it was chemical too. For centuries, the women of the harem worked alongside palace physicians, elder concubines and herbalists to create mixtures designed to enhance desire, soothe nerves, or manipulate moods. This wasn't just superstition, it was an art, and sometimes a science. At the centre of the room, a woman grinds something in a mortar with rhythmic precision. Her name is Zeliha, and she's not a concubine anymore. She's one of the herbal kalfas, women who age out of active service but remain in the palace as mentors, healers and advisors. She's the one you go to when your voice trembles before a summons, when your appetite disappears, when you need to be unforgettable. She gestures to a row of jars and begins her lesson. Here is damask rose, dried and powdered, mixed into oils to rub on the pulse points before bed. Not just to smell sweet. Rose oil is believed to ease anxiety and help the body stay supple and warm. Next to it is maca root, imported at great cost from far-off lands, ground into paste and stirred into honey. Said to stir the blood and wake the flame. A favourite of those who needed to feel bold or make someone else feel so. Then there's clove, crushed and simmered in wine, used sparingly to ease tension and enhance sensitivity. Too much, and you'll be up all night twitching. Too little, and nothing happens. And tucked at the back, a jar of saffron and dried figs, soaked together and then strained into a tonic. This one is rumoured to have aphrodisiac properties so potent that even the Sultan's horses were once accidentally dosed and wouldn't calm down for days. Zelia raises one eyebrow as she tells that story. It's an old joke in the harem, but the knowledge is serious. You watch as she adds mastic gum, cardamom, and a pinch of galangal, a cousin of ginger said to excite the liver, which, according to Ottoman medicine, was the seat of passion. She stirs slowly, all while reciting a verse of poetry under her breath, something about hearts made restless by moonlight. And here's the thing, these weren't just personal experiments. These potions were shared, often passed between women as gifts, bribes, or secret weapons. A vial of the right oil could secure a second night with the Sultan. A calming tea could help a girl sleep before her selection ceremony. A sweet lozenge tucked under the tongue might keep her voice from shaking during a recitation. One fringe recipe? A mixture of ground almonds, powdered cinnamon, dried mint and pearl dust. Yes, actual crushed pearls, believed to give the tongue wisdom and the breath sweetness. Did it work? Who knows? But if it gave a girl confidence, that was enough. And not all the mixtures were about pleasure. Some were about protection. Tucked away behind a curtain is a separate shelf. No labels, just colour-coded jars. These are the bitters, the teas and oils meant to prevent pregnancy or ease the body after a loss. Used quietly, cautiously, and never openly discussed. The harem officially discouraged their use, but in reality women found ways to access them when necessary. Not because they hated the idea of motherhood, but because they understood the risks of timing. A pregnancy too soon, or with the wrong political wind, could destroy a future. Some women, in moments of desperation, even consulted with outside mystics, Sufi women, midwives and herbalists who offered powders, candles, even incantations. One tale tells of a concubine who wore a silver ring inscribed with astrological symbols, claiming it made the Sultan dream of her. Did it? Unclear. But he did summon her the next night. There's an open scholarly debate about how much of this erotic medicine was actual pharmacology, and how much was psychological. Did the herbs work? Maybe. But maybe the act of preparing them, the ritual, the intent, was what made the real difference. Confidence, after all, is its own kind of potion. You sit with Zaliha for a while longer, and she tells you that many of these recipes came not from court physicians, but from the women themselves. Passed down orally, never written, because paper can be stolen but memory is loyal. A girl might learn only one or two in her time, but she'd guard them like treasure, and if she survived long enough, she'd teach them to the next. Tonight, one young concubine stops by the room. She's quiet, anxious. She's been summoned for the first time. Zaliha hands her a small cloth bundle, a sachet to tuck beneath her pillow. No instructions, no questions. Just a gentle hand on her shoulder and a look that says, "You will be fine." And maybe she will be, or maybe not. But that bundle, filled with herbs and hope, will be her armour. Because in a palace where men rule by sword and decree, the women of the harem wield cinnamon, honey and rosewater. Not as superstition, as survival, and sometimes as love. The palace gardens bloom violently in spring. Tulips explode in neat rows, crimson, yellow, deep purple, so vivid they almost hurt your eyes. The harem's courtyards, once quiet with winter's hush, now hum with life again. Girls walk arm in arm beneath blossoming almond trees, the air thick with bees and laughter, and for a moment everything feels almost gentle, almost safe. But don't let the petals fool you. Because in the harem, where beauty is currency and power can change with the wind, punishment waits behind even the most fragrant corners, and when it comes, it's not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in a single look from the Valid Sultan, or in the absence of a morning summons. Other times, it arrives like a guillotine in silk, swift, cold, and final. Today, a new arrival is scrubbing floors. Her name doesn't matter. It's already been stripped. Her back aches, her hands are raw, and no one speaks to her. Not because she's new, but because she was demoted. Her crime? She spilled tea on the Sultan's sleeve, not during an intimate moment, just during a formal gathering, a stumble, a drop, a stain. And now, she's no longer a concubine in training. She's a chambermaid. No more music lessons, no more silks. Her loot has been taken, her room reassigned, and she'll spend the rest of her days watching other women be chosen. That's the soft version of punishment here. For more serious offences, the consequences are much, much worse. You hear whispers about a woman named Maryam, once a favourite of the Sultan. Not the favourite, but close enough to be envied. She was sharp, maybe too sharp. caught exchanging words, just words, with a foreign servant during a festival. Nothing scandalous, but seen, reported. And in the harem, perception is as powerful as proof.